Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back into the studio for more on our third scale maquette of Kronos. It's been a little while, but the piece has endured underneath some plastic. And today we're going to be working on the little female figure again. So let's just get straight into it. First thing I do during a new session is check my structure. Structure is the one thing that always seems to wander off into the forest and disappear on you. It's super useful and reliable, but you tend to scare it away as you work. So, at the beginning of every session I always check it. I check that my bony landmarks line up the way that they do on my model, that my center line accurately represents the spine of my model, and that my center line is drawn in the center on both the front and the back view. I'm not working with a model here, so some of these things do get thrown out of the window as far as comparing to the model goes, and that's fine. I do have reference photos and a pose in mind, so I kind of know what I'm after. Because the figure is being held up by Kronos himself, I don't have to concern myself with the figure being balanced and able to stand on its own. However, I must make sure that I'm representing the spine with my center line in the center of the figure on both the front and the back view. At this small scale, things are a lot more forgiving, strangely enough. I chalk this up to people's imagination filling in all the gaps that you perhaps cannot sculpt because the piece is so small. Because it's so much more forgiving, I can be a little bit more loosey-goosey, so I measure a lot of the proportions using my fingers instead of something more accurate like a pair of calipers, for example. The proportions are based off a fairly simple method. I know, based on the smaller maquette that I made, more or less where the core of the body of the female needs to be in relationship to Kronos, or where her torso needs to sit in height, from crotch to neck, if you will. So, by making the torso, her torso, fill this space, I now have a set proportion that I can work out the lengths of limbs from, other proportions from. I know, for example, that the elbow reaches down to about the bottom of the ribcage on a standing figure. I know that from the top of the shoulder to the elbow is about the same distance as from elbow to the knuckles on the hand. I know that the pubic symphysis, also known in common English as the crotch, is in the middle of the body more or less. I obviously don't have a head, but I also know that without a head, the distance from the crotch to the bottom of the feet should be a little greater than the distance from the crotch to the pit of the neck. So as long as my legs are a little longer than my torso, I'm in a fairly decent place. Because of the scale, there is some wiggle room, and especially because proportions like this, the length of your legs compared to the body that is, vary quite a bit from person to person. I have some wiggle room and some room for error, if you will. I'd like to have a slender and strong female figure with athletic proportions, so in order to achieve that, I'll lean towards the legs being ever so slightly on the long side rather than the short side. I jump around quite a bit while sculpting in general, and I think this is pretty evident when you see me sculpt this figure. I hesitate a lot when it comes to an area where proportions are not worked out properly though. This is why you'll see me go very slowly when it comes to progressing the legs, for example. They're somewhat of an unknown, and I want to feel really solid about what I'm basing my decision making on in regards to the legs before pushing hard to build them. On this particular sculpture, the torso is what I'm basing my decision making on. This also gives me the chance to change tempo as I'm working. By the time I block in these legs, I'm working on refining the forms I've established in the torso. So I'm working on two kind of different ways, if you will. It lets me switch up my thinking from one way of working to another and gives the entire project a bit of fresh air every now and then for me. Let's take a quick second to talk about how you can support the channel. Subscribing and liking the video is of great help, of course. If you would like to get something in return for your support, however, head over to my Patreon page. On Patreon, you can watch exclusive content like the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture, which we just completed, and the Portrait series, which we just started, where I will show you everything you need to know about sculpting portraiture. You can also get personal feedback on your own work from me on anything you might need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. From this front view here, things ended up looking a little weird, a little out of proportion in the upper torso. I'm unsure if I ended up capturing on film how I fixed this issue. So instead of waiting for that, let's talk about it right now. Let's talk about what happened, why did it happen, and how did I end up fixing it and how you can avoid it. The issue that I ended up running into was that the width of the ribcage looked bloated, too wide essentially. And there's a few factors at play here that caused this to happen. One of them is misplacing of the contours. I misjudged what was contour on the right side, and the contour that I ended up placing was not supposed to be the contour from the front view at all. It was supposed to sit behind the contour. And this is a typical issue when not observing on equal terms. You establish one contour from one view and another contour from another view. Here I even placed the contour in the right place, but I was looking at the wrong contour. So make sure that when you sculpt and use the method that I use, that you are observing on equal terms, and that you don't observe the contour on one side independently from the contour on the other side. The other issue here is the fact that the ribcage is rotating a lot on top of the pelvis. There's a lot of torsion in this pose. This makes it difficult to observe on equal terms first of all, but it also presents a different issue, and that's the issue of context. Without the context of the width of the hips, the width of the ribcage looks wide, even if it's not. The same is true for the hips. Without the context of the width of the ribcage, the hips look wide. Because of the extreme torsion, we are looking at the side view of one bony mass while looking at the front view of the other. This created additional issues that I didn't really expect. The fix I landed on was simply moving the contour I made further back and reestablishing a new contour where the old one was, so that fixed the first issue. And that contour that I ended up establishing was slightly more accurate, better placed, and a little bit thinner. I ended up slimming down the width of the ribcage a bit more than I otherwise would because of the missing visual context of the width of the hip. Without that context, the ribcage looked wide no matter what. Ultimately, sculpture is a visual medium, and how it looks is really the most important thing. So if a ribcage that diverts from accuracy simply looks better, then it's the better option in my opinion. In addition, I added slightly more depth to the ribcage in order to help with the hips looking very wide. From a visual point of view, I think it ended up functioning pretty well, a lot better than it was for sure. Accuracy is only a useful tool when it helps you achieve what you are after. In this scenario, it actually negatively impacted what I was after, and so I made the necessary adjustments. I sacrificed accuracy in order to improve the work. I think that unless there is a point to accuracy, sacrificing it in order to make a better sculpture is always worth it. We're a bit behind here on YouTube, so if you want to see the changes that I'm talking about and how they ended up working out and looking, you can visit my Instagram page, where there is images of the finished piece already up. So you can check that out, there's a link in the description below. Obviously, anatomy is important here when you are making work that diverge from reality. With less reference to rely on, we must rely on something to create moderately convincing work, something else. And this is where anatomy comes in. Anatomy, however, is quite difficult, and knowing every muscle can be a little bit tricky. But there are some really useful tips that can help you along, that can help make things a little bit easier, if you will. Number one is leaning heavily on your bony landmarks. Placing bony landmarks well in space up and down, left and right, gives you tremendous freedom regarding the fleshy information that happens in between them. By placing the bottom of the sternum well, I have the origin of the arch of the ribcage ready to go. By having the width of my pelvis established early, right at the beginning actually when we made the box, I have a reference point as far as width goes when it comes to the arch of the ribcage and its bottom corners. Building the arch of the ribcage, having the width of the pelvis, and having the height of the pelvis gives me the area that the abdomen needs to occupy. With the arch of the ribcage established and the contour of my ribcage established from the front, the outer contour that is, I have the space I need to place the ribs within. By having the bottom of the pelvis, I can relate it to where the bottom of the buttocks need to be and place the buttocks accordingly. I can decide on the width of my shoulders by finding the distal end of my clavicles. I can decide on the width from one distal end of the clavicle to the next, or to the other, sorry, by comparing this width to the already established width of the pelvis. Now the shoulders simply hang off the end of the clavicles. This gives me the origin of the arm muscles and the insertion for the pectoral muscles. So now you can see how things begin to fall into place, one by one, when you establish some bony landmarks. This is the structure of my figure that I rely on. I want this to be symmetrical and functional, and if they are, I will have tremendous freedom to do what I want with the fleshy information that exists in between. Because of the crazy amount of torsion between the pelvis and the ribcage, this becomes even more important. Once the bony landmarks are set up and the bony masses function well, the muscles simply get pulled from one to the other. If my oblique muscles, which are located on the flanks and attaches to the ribs and the iliac crest of the pelvis, essentially filling the space between the pelvis and the ribcage on the side of the body. If the oblique muscles need to attach to the ribcage and the iliac crest of the pelvis, and these two bony masses are rotated on top of each other, one oblique will be leaning heavily backwards, while the other will be more upright than normal. This happens because the bottom corner of the ribcage is way further forward on one side compared to the other. As the front plane of the ribcage rotates, so does the entire ribcage and everything associated with it. If I set up my bony masses first, I don't need to think too much about this, however. I know the space the oblique needs to occupy, and if that space has distorted because of the torsion between the pelvis and the ribcage, then the muscle itself distorts in order to occupy the space that it needs to occupy. In addition to knowing where muscles are, it's important to understand how structure works and how you need to use it in order to create a solid looking figure. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more videos. I put out a new video every Thursday, so stay tuned for next week. If you want to support the channel, visit the link to my Patreon page in the description below the video to learn how. Until then, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.